apartment with food in plenty and beautiful scenery.
This programme is about women in a man's world, not only surviving but triumphing when the odds were stacked against them.
We are indeed most fortunate women!
I think there was a magic about Tenko.
And I think what it did change was the idea that women's stories would capture the imagination.
You are enemy! You are defeated the women!
Tenko recreated the true story of a group of women in World War II, a piece of history whose rediscovery was to enthrall the nation's viewers.
It actually moved forward the way women were depicted on television.
It was just seminal for all of us in different ways. We're not exaggerating. We're still talking about it 25 years later, for heaven's sake.
All-woman television dramas are now taken for granted, but if it hadn't been for Tenko, they might never have existed. The story begins in 1978 when Tenko's creator, Lavinia Warner, was a researcher on the ITV programme This Is Your Life.
We decided to do Dame Margot Turner's story. She had a fantastic past life story, part of which was being a prisoner of the Japs during the war. It was up to me as researcher to find other women who she'd been in camp with, who she hadn't seen for 40 years. They just looked like yours and my auntie, you know, very ordinary. And yet they had the most incredible tales of courage and bonding that had happened in the camps. And it actually spurred me on to find out more of the other women's stories as well.
Dame Margot Turner, this is your life.
The BBC programme Omnibus commissioned Lavinia Warner to make a documentary about Margot Turner, in which she and fellow survivor Betty Jeffrey returned to Sumatra.
Exactly 37 years to the day since we came into these houses.
Margot and Betty were among the thousands of women captured by the Japanese after the invasion of Singapore in 1942. They were interned in camps for 3.5 years. Close to half of those prisoners of war died.
Everybody was ill, everybody was starving, everybody was very thin, but we had to keep up with the chores. We had to chop wood, we had to do nursing, especially nursing. There was so much sickness.
And I thought, this story has just got to be seen by many more people, you know, it's such an important story. And actually it is then that I thought, I've got to make a drama out of it.
Lavinia Warner pitched her idea to the BBC, but this was Television Centre in the 1970s, where men were men and women were secretaries.
It was male-dominated. You know, men did have the top jobs, all the top jobs.
Though the BBC's successes included World War II dramas like Secret Army and Colditz, it was mainly jobs for the boys. Would-be escapees and freedom fighters for the good-looking ones, Nazis for the rest.
Shot whilst trying to escape. You were a witness. Yes, sir. Clear up everything.
But there was one man who thought the all-girl Tenko might just work, and luckily he was the head of drama, Graham MacDonald.
It was a very unusual programme for him to have greenlit at the time. A whole load of women, no makeup, in rags, in a prisoner of war camp. Most people, I think, in telly then would have said, no, we can't do that. No, who'll watch it?
MacDonald was convinced there was an audience for Tenko, but his was a lone voice. Ken Reddington, the producer he asked to take it on, shared the view of most.
I said, we can't do that. We've not got the facilities, we can't afford it. I think it's a big, big mistake.
Ken Reddington was an experienced hand at BBC dramas, delivering solid successes like The Brothers and the more upmarket adaptations Anna Karenina and To Serve Them All My Days.
All right! Places! 6 seconds or extra pay. No, sir, really, sir. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Dealing with a class of unruly schoolboys was one thing, but this was a prison camp full of women with attitude.
I was petrified. we're not in that sort of, well, I wasn't in that sort of game, and nobody else had ever done anything like it, and so I was very scared.
He has a very good line of worrying, Ken. I mean, you see this anxious face, the other side, sort of waiting or whatever. I mean, he does always look worried to death, which I suppose producers have to do. I mean, maybe that goes with the job.
And in fact, I was totally wrong, because never before in my life have I known, guessing now the number, but 12 women getting on so well together.
To give himself some protection, Ken Reddington hired Pennant Roberts, a director who'd had experience of dealing with a tough female lead in the shape of Juliet Bravo. But Tenko had a dozen of them.
My first concern was that I cast a group of actresses who all had the ability to take over the storytelling from one week to the next individually, but that would also then work together. They had to be team players.
Well, we should have someone to represent us while we're here, an official leader.
Well, what about you, Doctor? You're the obvious person.
No, I shall have my hands full. I feel it should be somebody else.
The first difficulty that I overcame in casting was determining who I should cast first. And it took me some time to determine that I had to work from Marian Jefferson. Once I'd cast Marian Jefferson, then other bits of the jigsaw would then start to fit into place.
Anne Bell had played the oppressed Jane Eyre in a BBC adaptation and a dutiful wife in Iris Murdoch's An Unofficial Rose. She jumped at the complex part of Marian Jefferson, the quiet military wife who became the leader of the Tenko women.
And it was a fascinating idea. I mean, obviously it was fascinating. Also, it was terrific. I mean, suddenly there's hundreds of parts for women, which is very, very rare and very lovely.
Tenko gave other young actresses a chance to escape from the roles 70s TV drama trapped them in.
I seemed to get cast quite frequently as the serving wench. I was, you know, plump and rosy looking and rather innocent looking. And so I had to say, for I think the first 3 or 4 parts that I had, Tom Brown's School Days being one of them, I'm a good girl, I am.
Oh, don't worry, the coast will be clear in a minute. I'll see you safe back to your room.
You'll be very kind to help me, Master Tom, and me but a poor serving wench.
In the 1970s, the traditional career path for serving wenches was to graduate to Jason King's love interest or blood-soaked damsels in distress in a Hammer house of horror. But in the real world, women were challenging their stereotyped role. Could TV be far behind? Well, yes, as Louise Jameson found after trying to break the mould when she was cast as Leela, Doctor Who's traditionally winsome sidekick.
She was an extremely feisty, aggressive character. And she came on the crest of that feminist wave that was happening politically, but they took her clothes off to do it. I mean, what did I wear? A leather leotard. So, you know, was I really fighting the feminist cause with that role? I don't know.
But in Tenko, Louise Jameson found feistiness which wasn't compromised. Blanche was an East End prostitute who got on with the job once she was in camp.
I suppose it's no good appealing to your better nature.
No, Doctor! It isn't!
The tart with the art of gold only belongs in Hollywood movies.
But even in Tenko, looks were important when it came to playing a prisoner of war.
Obviously, we wanted thin ladies who didn't put on weight.
He said, need to lose a bit of weight. How much do you weigh at the moment? And I hesitated, as I was unwilling to tell him. And I hesitated, and he said, what, about sort of 9 stone? Well, I hadn't been 9 stone since I was about 12 years old. So I lied and said, oh, yes.
And that little white lie got Stephanie Cole the part of Dr. Beatrice Mason.
Your father was a vicar, then?
Yes. All good, God-fearing folk, my family.
What happened to you?
Saw a different kind of light. Followed it in spite of him.
But there was just one more role to fill.
Because of the character of Rose, because it was a showy character, then it was appropriate then to have somebody with a higher profile.
Stephanie Beecham's profile had been raised by shedding her clothes in such Eurotrash movies as Si può essere più bastardi dell'Ispettore Cliff, before she went upmarket, playing opposite genuine Hollywood aristocracy.
I started on what looked like rather a good film career. Co-starred with Ava Gardner, and then I co-starred with Marlon Brando, and then I wouldn't be cooperative with publicity for the nightcomers. I was told I would do this, that and the other, and I said, no, I won't. And Joseph E. Levine in his office in New York said, you leave here with that attitude and you're dead. And I said, ever seen a skeleton dance, and left the room.
Stephanie's exit led directly to the cast of Tenko, which she joined to play the upper-class Rose, for whom the Second World War was a cruel inconvenience in her busy social life.
I just thought, what fun to be in a prisoner of war camp with somebody, as somebody whose idea of a major tragedy is a ladder in her stocking.
Never said that before.
Said what?
Sorry.
I'm sorry. Do you want blood? All right, I'm sorry, sorry, sorry.
The early part of Tenko gave us a glimpse of the lives of our women before the camp, and the only place that could reproduce those sun-drenched days of gin slings on the terrace and dinner dances at Raffles was Singapore itself, so they moved there to film in 1980.
It was very important, I felt, to show how the women had been before, the kind of lives that they'd had, which were privileged lives. And there's this real difference and juxtaposition of lives before and after.
What's going on?
The British complacently assumed Singapore was immune from Japanese attack, so, like Pearl Harbor, nobody was prepared for it.
Are they Japanese?
They're Japanese, all right.
Tenko showed how expatriates sailing home were sitting ducks for the Japanese aircraft. Shipwrecked survivors managed to make it to the Sumatran shore, only to be rounded up by the Japanese, where the women and children were separated from the men. And this is where the women of Tenko are first thrown together as they are marched off through the jungle to the camps.
How far? How far are we going?
What? Longo! Longo!
I'm afraid you might say that.
Actually, they did have quite a long way to go, as the production marched from the steamily authentic but expensive Malaysian jungle to the far more cost-effective Dorset. There, with the ingenuity of a Colditz inmate making a Nazi uniform out of bed blankets, the BBC designers built a replica Japanese prisoner of war camp. Of course, a camp needs a camp commandant, and there was really only one man for the job.
It would appear at times that World War II in the Far East was fought for my benefit, so that I could have lots of acting jobs, being in the Japanese army, the Chinese army, the Korean army, the Vietnam, all of them.
After playing a whole platoon of Asian soldiers across 60s television, Burt Kwok soon cornered the Oriental market in the cinema and played Mr. Ling in the Bond film Goldfinger before getting his big break as Peter Sellers' overzealous manservant in the Pink Panther series.
I was at sort of the height of my notoriety as Kato in the Pink Panther movies. And the public perception of me in those days was this sort of perpetual motion, moving projectile who never stood still for very long.
Inspector Clouseau's residence.
And I looked at a couple of the Tenko scripts and I thought, now, here's a guy who doesn't have to fall down, he doesn't have to hit anybody, he doesn't have to jump up and down and run around. He can just stand still and say the words. And I thought, this is what an actor's supposed to do.
You are now in Japanese prison camp. I am your commandant, Captain Yamauchi.
With Burt Kwok's Yamauchi firmly in charge, the Tenko setup was complete. An early episode introduced the character of Dorothy Bennett, played by Veronica Roberts.
She arrives in the camp having just literally lost her husband, and the baby then gets ill, and the baby dies.
In a typically controversial storyline, Dorothy turned to prostitution, hoping that small favours from the guards would make her life in the camp more bearable.
I mean, all these things happened in camp. I mean, the real women knew women who became prostitutes in camp, and the real women's reaction to that was those prostitutes kept the Japanese away from them.
God, how can you eat? Because if you haven't even got a bloody smoke. Guards too frightened to do deals, are they? Don't interfering little snob.
I'm not a glam puss, you know, I'm not sort of It's never been what I've been cast for. And the idea that you can get up in the morning and however you look, they're going to make you look worse.
It was the one job I can remember as you went in and said to your makeup lady, "Oh, I've got a spot overnight." "Oh, how wonderful," she'd say. "Oh, look, there's a little rash there."
I'm no beauty queen myself.
Makeup wasn't the only personal grooming issue to raise its ugly head.
Ken came to the rehearsal room and said he's had something sensitive which he wanted to raise, and perhaps it'd be a good time for the production team to go upstairs and have a cup of coffee.
And he said to us, "Would it be all right? Could you please go home and ask permission of your lovers, husbands, boyfriends? Because there are no razors in the camp, we need you to grow the hair under your arms and on your legs."
And we weren't the slightest bit worried about not shaving our armpits, but it was the fact that we actually had to consider our boyfriends and husbands before we made such a decision.
And there was a kind of collective, did he just say that? Did feminism just pass him by completely? So there was a wonderful moment of we need to run it by who?
Men. It wasn't just Ken Reddington who had problems understanding the women in his charge. Fleet Street's TV critics, for whom the term unreconstructed might have been coined, had no idea what they were watching.
It got terrible, terrible notices. They didn't seem to realise what it was. I mean, there were all things like Tesco, not Tenko.
There were even plenty of TV insiders who thought Tenko didn't stand a chance, and for good reason. Getting noticed in the autumn schedule of 1981 wasn't going to be easy. ITV went teddy bear mad, promoting the then most expensive television drama ever made, Brideshead Revisited. Whilst at the BBC, the publicity budget was being spent on a classy historical epic for BBC Two.
A series called The Borgias was going to be the big series of that autumn, and it died without a trace, and we sort of came from nowhere.
Halfway through the first series, viewing figures had risen to 18 million, making Tenko the BBC's most popular drama. Surprise, surprise, it started getting great reviews, all of which brought an extra dimension to life in the Dorset camp.
Life came to imitate art. Those actresses grew so close and bonded so well with each other on set and off set, and it was as if they were in a little camp, of their own.
With subject matter like that, we just felt we owed it to the real people to get it right.
The commitment to getting it right was shared by the writers, who wanted the stories to be an accurate portrayal of what went on in the POW camps, even if this meant fighting to introduce taboo subjects like lesbianism into the storylines of a mainstream British drama for the first time.
We can still be friends, can't we?
Oh, Sal. And Ken went berserk. He said, "No, that will be turn-off time. We won't do anything about lesbians and stuff." And it was the only time that I really had a bit of a set-to with Ken. And I said that I didn't want to write for a series if it didn't deal with issues like that.
People are talking about you and Sally.
Well, let them. I don't care.
Well, I do care. I don't like to see you the subject of cheap gossip.
That's too
And
bad,
I can't
isn't
allow
it?
you to give anything less than your best.
In the end, we reached this compromise where the story could be done, but the word lesbian must never be mentioned.
Can't afford time-consuming relationships, especially ones that can't lead anywhere.
And Bee's character, who, if she had been living today, probably would have been a lesbian, probably would have had a relationship. The fact that she doesn't, the fact that she has feelings for people, but they're not expressed and don't need to be expressed in that way, just feels so right for that character.
I actually rather loved playing this very spiky, difficult, rather grim woman.
Blanche, here you're able to get cigarettes.
Do you now?
And off the record, of course.
Of course. Go on.
Look, is there any chance of getting any quinine?
Nope.
And it's a terrific performance. The whole physicality of the hands in the pockets all of the time. And you could caricature it, and she always stays on the right side. Absolutely.
Stephanie Cole put in a physical performance of a completely different kind as her hands came out of her pockets and finally got hold of a lethal weapon in Open All Hours.
Ronnie Barker had seen the first series and he had decided that I would be good to play the Black Widow. So at the same time, I was doing Open All Hours. So in the morning, I'd be rehearsing Open All Hours, and in the afternoon, I'd be up on the 5th floor rehearsing Tenko. So it was an extraordinary thing. I mean, it was the sublime to the gorblimey, or rather the other way around.
You get dressed up, you come out to do a bit of shopping, you don't expect to be knocked off your feet by a runaway errand boy.
Of course you don't, Mrs. Fairfeatherstone. Come on, sit over here, my dear. Just sit down a moment, take the weight off your purse. There we are.
Not even my husband used to get as close as that.
Tenko returned for a second series in 1982 with a new camp, some new faces, and the dramatic exit of one of the old ones.
You've arrived. It's all over. We're only just beginning.
Ken came up to me and said,
"Would you mind dying?" And I said, well, only if, you know, like it's on screen and I'm incontinent and really get a good death scene.
So, while the more dispensable inmates succumbed to malaria or beriberi, Stephanie Beecham got to escape from the camp and meet her man, who popped up in the jungle for a night of passion. Of course, she couldn't possibly get away with it. A gunshot wound to the back left Rose paralysed and set her up for a sumptuously slow decline.
Is there anything else I can do for you?
You can finish me off.
What I loved about the writing of that scene was that it was quite terse, it was quite short. Economy and silence on television is incredibly powerful.
When I was little, now, I hope it'll never come.
In 1985, after her Tenko demise, Stephanie Beecham brought her ball-breaking persona to the role of Connie, the Midlands businesswoman with that look on her face. This was the perfect training ground for Sable, the character Beecham went on to play in The Colbys and Dynasty. With the last episode of Series 2 of Tenko still attracting 15 million viewers, a third series would have seemed a foregone conclusion. But the BBC suits proved more inscrutable than a Tenko guard.
We were their best-selling show, and they wanted to axe it. Now, I truly believe, it might be paranoid of me, but I believe it was because it was a series about women, where women were the engines of the piece, etc., etc. Beloved Michael Grade came along and said, "You're out of your minds. You've got to keep it." So indeed, we did another series.
My George, it's the cavalry!
So, after a year away from television, Tenko returned to the screens in 1984. And the action resumed in 1945, when the Allies regained power in the Far East and the Japanese were forced to surrender.
Thank you, Major.
And after 3.5 years in captivity, the survivors from the camps attempted to return to their old lives in Singapore.
It was dealing with what I consider to be a fascinating period of the women's lives, and just as difficult in some ways as their time in camp. That is, when they came out.
Which reminds me, we've been invited to a real pre-war puckadoo at Government House. You know, gongs will be worn, all that kind of caper. So what I suggest... What on earth are you doing?
Tenko did more than unearth a forgotten chapter of history. In 30 episodes, it created a gallery of characters so strong that when the women finally departed for England, 14 million viewers watched them go.
Well, that's over.
But in 1985, they gathered together again for a Christmas reunion.
Tonight, let's remember all those who were in the camps. Those who are still alive, those who died, either in captivity or as a result of those years.
By then, British TV was catching up with society, and dramas with strong female leads were the norm. District Nurse and Nanny were big homegrown successes, whilst Cagney and Lacey proved that women cops could kick ass and look as good as the guys. Lavinia Warner proved she could kick ass as a producer when she set up Warner Sisters, her award-winning production company. Louise Jameson starred in a 1992 Warner Sisters production for the BBC called Rides, before going on to play Rosa DiMarco in Albert Square, which was a long way from Jersey and one of her juiciest roles.
There you go.
Lovely. I think I was the envy of every woman in Britain. I played John Little's girlfriend for 4 years. Live-in lover for 2 of them, girlfriend for 2 of them.
After Tenko, Stephanie Cole became sought after in both comedy and drama on TV. In 1987, she received one of those scripts that drop through the door once in an actor's lifetime.
It was quite a thin envelope, and I opened it and I looked at the script, and it said Talking Heads, Soldiering On by Alan Bennett. And there was just a little note from Innes saying, hope you enjoy it, give me a ring when you've read it. And I opened it, and it said Muriel, and she started to talk, and I thought, oh, right, I wonder where I come in. So I kept reading, and then I flipped through and I realised that it was a monologue.
Job, sorting out the 1 or 2 things I want to keep. I won't be sorry to see the back of most of it, quite honestly. I feel it puts me more in the same sort of boat as Ralph. Lay not up for yourself treasures on earth type thing. Lilies of the field syndrome. I said this to the vicar who was looking around. He thought this was a healthy attitude. And how much did I think the walnut side table would fetch? It would go so well in their hall.
In 2003, Stephanie Beecham roared back onto British TV screens in another all-woman cast, the prison drama Bad Girls.
Oh, Phil, this is more than my nails can hack. It's pretty ghastly, Bev, but we'll soon work our wits on it. You really think so, darling? Oh. Got into the royal enclosure at bloody Ascot, didn't we?
The likes of Bad Girls and Footballers' Wives may rule the roost now, but the women of Tenko fought the war to make them possible. Tenko was an extraordinary drama about the bonds that were formed between women in a Japanese prison camp. It also had a deep and lasting personal effect on the women who came together to make it.
The friendships, I don't think we could ever have anticipated that we would still all be friends as we are.
I've never had a similar experience to that intensity that we had on Tenko, again, in any other production that I've done.
The description support group almost cheapens what it was. It was, they saved my life.